Well, there was once a young girl by the name of Louise. She lived on a farm about 2 miles away from town with her mother and father. And her mother and father were very, very protective of her. You see, they had wanted a lot of children, but they were only blessed with Louise. Well, Louise was homeschooled, and she worked very hard around the farm, so she never really went into town. And as the children her age grew older, there was a lot of mischief and gossip and talk about Louise, because they all saw her and she was so beautiful, but none of them knew her. Well, as Louise grew, the stories about Louise grew as well. There was so much mystery around her, and the boys used to come to the edge of the property just to watch her. Well, as Louise got to be in her late teens, her father decided that he never wanted her to leave the farm. So he built a house for her to live with her family when she got married and had children. And he put out the word to the townspeople that Louise was ready to take a husband. So the boys who had been watching her all along knew that she was so beautiful. They wanted to come by and meet her, and they all wanted to take her on a date. So they would come by the house one after the other, and they all would go on a date with her. But the funny thing was, at the end of the first date, they all ran away screaming, and no one knew what happened. And none of those boys ever wanted a second date. Well, all the boys in the town had visited and had dated Louise, and so the father didn't know what to do. He knew that she was smart, she was beautiful, she worked hard. He couldn't understand why these boys weren't interested in a second date or interested in coming around again. So he put the word out to the next town and the next town. And the boys from those towns started coming over, and the same thing happened. They would all go on a first date, and then they would run away screaming. And the talk was perhaps Louise couldn't talk. Perhaps she wasn't as pretty as they remembered. Perhaps she had a very sour personality. Or maybe she had some kind of a deformity or some kind of a problem that they didn't know about. Well, the parents knew none of that was true. They couldn't understand why no one wanted to date their daughter. So all of the boys from all of the surrounding towns came by, and none of them wanted a second date. So they stopped coming around, and the father thought, well, perhaps Louise will just be an old maid. A couple years went by, and a boy came up the driveway one day as the father was bringing the animals in for the night. And he said, "What do you want?" And the boy said, "Well, I've heard about your daughter, Louise, and I've heard she's very beautiful, and I might just be the man for her." So the father was very excited, so he brought him into the house to meet Louise, and Louise was very excited to go on a date with him. So he extended his hand, his arm. She took his arm, and out they went, him thinking that the date was starting right then and there. Well, they got about halfway down the drive, out of sight of the house and out of hearing range, and she turned to him and said, "Not now. Come back at midnight." Well, she was very beautiful, so he did as she asked. He left, and he came back at midnight and knocked on the window, very lightly, so her parents wouldn't hear. The window to her bedroom opened, and out she came in her nightgown. They walked down the road to about where they had been that afternoon, and she stopped and said, "Now, before we go, I need you to promise me something." Well, he was mesmerized by her, so he shook his head. Whatever she wanted, he was ready to do. She said, "Now, tonight is going to be a test. We're going to find out if you are worthy of loving me." He said, "Okay." And she said, "Whatever happens tonight, if you pass the test, I will go out with you again. If you don't pass the test, you have to promise me that you'll never tell anyone what happened tonight." Well, he couldn't imagine what could possibly happen. So he said, "Okay," put his hand on his heart and said, "I solemnly swear I won't tell anyone of the events of this evening." And she said, "Okay, let's go." And off she went. Well, he had a hard time keeping up with her. It was almost like she was floating in front of him. Well, he hurried to catch up with her. The sky was dark, just a sliver of a moon, and it was very foggy. And he was going very quickly as she moved through town. She consistently was about 30 feet in front of her. They got to the edge of town and the beginning of the forest, and she walked down the trail of the forest, and he again hurried to catch up with her, and the trees were looming over the trail, almost like monsters. It was so foggy and spooky. Dogs were howling in the background. Maybe they were wolves. the kind of noises and the kind of night you'd imagine in a story like this. So she was going ahead of him, and all of a sudden she stopped. And he noticed her hair blowing in the wind and her nightgown blowing in the wind. And so he got up to where she was, and he looked around, and it was an old graveyard. The headstones covered with moss and vines, and she was standing in front of a grave that seemed to be kind of fresh. When he got there, she looked at him, then she reached down and grabbed an old rusty shovel, and she started digging that grave. And he was just watching her. And when she hit something hard, she fell to her knees and she started brushing away the dirt until she came to the top of a coffin. She opened the coffin, she moved away the shroud that was covering the body. She reached in and ripped off an arm from that coffin, held it up to her mouth, staring at him. She took a big bite, chomped very loudly on that arm, and then she looked at him and said, "If you want to be with me, you'll do what I do. You'll eat what I eat." And she handed him the arm. Well, he didn't skip a beat. He took the arm and he took a bite. And he thought, this didn't taste the way he thought it was going to taste. And then he realized it was a prank. It was candy and cake. And he was furious that she would do such a thing to him. The rage just billowing up in his face and his eyes furious, filled with anger. And she realized that he figured it out, and she started laughing. And she said, "I've got so many boys here, and they've all run away screaming, but not you. You've shown me that you're brave, and you have a lot of courage, and that's the kind of husband I want. I'll go out with you again." And he stood back and he said, "That wasn't very nice, tricking me like that." "I thought we were the same, but I guess not." And with that, he leaned down and he picked up the shovel. And he started digging the grave next to the one she had uncovered. And when he hit the coffin, he bent down and he opened the lid. He smoothed that shroud apart. He grabbed an arm off that corpse and he ripped it off. He took a big bite of that corpse. And this time, it was Louise that ran away screaming.